after the blood's been passed through the glomerulus and everything's been filtered out of it, what passes into the nephron is called the filtrate. So the filtrate is processed through the nephron, and after it goes through the nephron, it's called urine. Now, urine is the leftovers of what flows through our blood. So that's going to have a lot of metabolic waste, such as urea. It's also going to have toxins, excess salts, excess water, any drugs that we've broken down, and excess vitamins if we don't need them. Taking a urine test, for example, gives us a good snapshot of what our metabolism is doing at any given point, when we take that sample, which is why you'll see athletes, for example, get tested, drug tested, after an important event or before an important event, and they just take a urine sample. And from the urine sample, we can see if there's any drugs or drug metabolites in their system which help them or whatever be more competitive. But anyways, as the collecting duct empties urine into the renal pelvis, the renal pelvis will connect to the ureters, and this brings us to the urinary tract. So let's have a look at where urine goes after that. So you can see, whoops, didn't mean to do that. Let's try and line this up again. There we go. After the blood passes into the kidney and exits again, filtered out, and composition adjusted, the urine is going to flow from the kidney into the ureters. From the ureters, it travels to the bladder, and then the last step would be, or the last section of the urinary tract is going to be the urethra, which is the opening that takes the urine outside of the body. So the urinary tract is responsible for the transport, the storage, and the elimination of urine. Now, the urinary tract is one of those tracts that are different between the male and the female. We can see here in this picture, we get the male on the left-hand side and the female on the right-hand side. The major change happens after we get to the bladder. So we're going to have the bladder right here on the male, and it's going to be right here on the female. It's been cut in half on the female, but it's left entire on the male. And as you can see, once we leave the bladder, we get into the urethra. And in the urethra, the male is much longer. It travels through the prostate gland and then into the penis before it exits to the outside world. In the female, the urethra is quite short. You can see here, it travels from the bladder to a position slightly anterior to the vagina, and then urine is voided out there. So there is a little bit of a difference, well, quite a bit of a difference between the final parts of the urinary tract between the male and the female. So from the kidney, we have these pair of muscular tubes, one for each kidney, that are the ureters, and they're going to collect the urine from the renal pelvis, and they're going to carry the urine away from the kidney, downwards, and into the urinary bladder. So on the picture here, you can see how the kidneys are connected to the bladder via those muscular tubes. Just like the kidneys, the ureters are going to be retroperitoneal, and the ureters will enter into the posterior or the back wall of the urinary bladder. And there's a couple of reasons why that happens. And let's have a look at the next slide. So in our next slide, sorry guys, my video screen's all over. Here we go. On this slide here, you can see this down here is the openings to the ureters. So the ureters travel in the back. You can see them right here, and they actually attach in the bladder on the lower side on the back. They're also enter on an angle, and they're also slit shaped rather than a round shaped entrance. And what that does is it prevents the urine, once it's stored in the bladder, from traveling back out and heading back up to the kidneys, which wouldn't be very good at all. So if we look at the bladder, just real quickly right now, you can see that the bladder wall is quite thick with muscle. So the bladder is quite a thick muscle. And when it squeezes in order for us to urinate, it will add pressure. So it's possible that that could happen. But the way that the ureters the openings to the ureters are structured, it prevents that backflush of urine from heading to the bladder back into the kidneys. Now, if we look at the microanatomy of the tissue plan of the inner wall of the urethra, the ureter, you'll see that we've got this purple layer of inner mucosa. So this layer here is going to be our inner mucosa. Directly on the outside of that, we're going to have a layer of smooth muscle, and you can, if you notice the tissue here, the thickness of the muscle is quite big. The bladder has a very high amount of muscular presence there. And on the outside of that muscle, we're going to have our outer connective tissue. It's going to hold the ureter in place. The inner mucosa, so let's have a look at what's on the inside at first. The inner mucosa is going to be transitional epithelium. Now, if you think back to your histology lab in the last course, biology course you did, the transitional epithelium is going to be one that can stretch, right? It's going to be able to get bigger and to get smaller. And that's important because when liquids travel out of the kidneys, or urine's traveling out of the kidneys faster, it's more important for that space to get bigger. And then when it's not traveling as fast, then it can constrict, and we won't have any damage to those epithelial cells on the inside. Directly outside of that mucosa, we're going to have the middle muscle layer, and that's going to have longitudinal and circular bands of smooth muscle. And then the outside, the connective tissue is going to be continuous with the renal capsule, so it's going to be covered by the same capsule protection that covered the kidneys, and it's also going to be continuous with the peritoneum. Now, by the time we get down into the urinary bladder, we're looking at a muscular hollow organ that's main focus is to store urine. Okay, so urine collects in the bladder until we get enough, and then our body lets us know that by sending messages to our brain to let us know that our bladder is relatively full and it needs to be vacated. The size of the bladder will change depending on how well hydrated you are, when was the last time you went to the bathroom, and so on and so forth. A full bladder can actually contain up to about 1 liter of urine. Generally, you will feel like you need to go to the bathroom well before your bladder gets completely full, but it does have the potential to contain about 1 liter of urine. So the urinary bladder is there as a storage vessel. If we look at the inside of the bladder, we're going to see that the mucosal lining has these folds that allow it to expand and contract, to get bigger and smaller, and we call these folds rugae. And then the question there is, where else so far in this course did we see rugae? I'll give you a hint. It's between the esophagus and the duodenum. So you can look that up. Again, let's have a look at the tissue plan, the microanatomy of the urinary bladder. We're going to see, again, mucosa, the submucosa, and we're going to see those muscular layers. Now, in the bladder, the muscular layers have a name because the bladder muscle is quite important, and we call that muscle layer the detrusor muscle. It makes up a powerful muscle, which allows us to void our bladder of urine when it gets too full. Again, the muscular layer is going to have 3 layers of smooth muscle, and again, where do we see 3 layers of smooth muscle before? Can you think of that? Anyways, hopefully you can. What happens is when we get the contraction of the detrusor muscle, the bladder gets smaller, and as that gets smaller, we put pressure on a liquid. It doesn't get smaller. Liquid doesn't contract. It doesn't get smaller in volume. As a result of that, it gets forced out. and from there, once the detrusor muscle contracts, it forces urine into the urethra, and the urine can get taken out of the body. So here's a look at the urethra right here. This, of course, is going to be the male urethra. First thing it does is travel through the prostate gland. So the urethra is what's going to carry the urine from the neck of the bladder, which is this area right at the bottom. So this is what we consider the neck. It's going to take that urine once the bladder contracts, gets smaller, and it's going to be forced into the urethra, and it's going to be carried outside of the body. Now, like I was saying earlier, the urethra from the males and the females are going to be quite a bit different. It differs in lengths as well as function. The male urethra is longer than that of the female, and one of the reasons is that, of course, is the male urinary system has a common exit with the reproductive system. So the urethra helps transport both urine for the urinary system and sperm, which is, of course, part of the reproductive system. Now, it can't do this at the same time. Obviously, there's mechanisms that prevent that, but it does have a dual function in the male. In the female, we're just going to have the urethra, as a part of the urinary system. So here's again a cross section of the male. The urethra is going to start at the base of the bladder right here. And it's going to travel through the prostate gland, through the peritoneum, into the penis, perineum, into the penis, and then outside of the body. Well, you can see up here, this is the beginning of the reproductive system for the male. We've got a couple of sets of glands that the urethra share with the reproductive system. So the urethra from the neck of the bladder to the tip of the penis travels about 18 to 20 centimeters, so it's a considerable amount longer than what we see in the female. We subdivide the male urethra into 3 different parts depending on where the urethra is. Okay, so the first part is called the prostatic urethra, and this passes through the center of the prostate gland. After we leave the prostatic urethra, we get into the membranous urethra, and this passes through the muscles of the pelvic floor, which we call the perineum. And then finally, when we get into the penile or the spongy urethra, this is the part of the urethra that passes through the penis. So these different subdivisions are named based on the location of the urethra. Now, by contrast, in females, the urethra is quite short, only 3 to 5 centimeters, and it travels from the neck of the bladder to the opening, which is in the vestibule, which is just anterior to the vagina. And like I said before, the female urethra is only going to carry urine. It's not going to have any function whatsoever in the reproductive system.